don't forget that you're a person when you come to work.
Yeah.
So you might have your game face on, but people want to deal with people, the real people, So it's always good to be open and honest, and yeah, a little playful. If that's how you are outside of work, why would you change when you're inside of work? So it's good not to put on some kind of persona when you're in the office.
And I think the other thing too is, and this was a hard lesson for me, is to not take things personally. When I first started, things were happening. If things were broken or we weren't meeting a strategic goal, I would take that very personally. Or if somebody was upset about something that, it's somehow now they hate me and my family, that kind of thing. It's not a personal thing. It's not an attack on you. It's maybe a process that people are upset with, or maybe the timeline that people are upset with.